Well, a year ago, before Crimea, before Ukraine, before ISIS, before Ebola, the #1 threat in the world was Iran. Well, Iran hasn't disappeared, even though we've pretty much ignored it in the 24-hour news world we now live in. But there's lots happening there, or so it appears. The last year has seen a new administration in Iran, but does that mean a new attitude? Some say yes. Others say, don't be fooled. Iran hasn't changed. What to believe? At the Turning Point table tonight, Janice Stein is the director of the Munk School of Global Affairs at the University of Toronto, and Samantha Nutt is the founder of War Child Canada. Joining us from Detroit, Saeed Khan, who teaches Middle East history at Wayne State University, and from Denver tonight, Nader Hashemi, professor of Middle East Studies at the University of Denver. Their thoughts in a moment, but first, some background. To most Westerners, this guy was a nut. But to Iranians, he was their president. Mahmoud Ahmadinejad led with his mouth. The Holocaust never happened. Israel should be wiped off the face of the earth. The Americans should never be trusted. If Iran wanted nuclear power, they'd have it. And his actions. Funding and arming some of the most reviled powers in the world. From Hezbollah to the Assad regime in Syria. Nut or not, Ahmadinejad has been gone for a year now, replaced by this man, Hassan Rouhani, described in Iranian terms as a moderate. In that time, he's put Iran in direct talks with the West and frozen his most controversial nuclear development. No deal yet, but some of the big players remain hopeful.
Today, we are closer to a deal that would make the entire world safer and more secure.
And Kerry's boss, while mostly silent, is said to believe making a deal with Iran is the linchpin to defeating ISIS, even to an overall peace in the Middle East.
We must give diplomacy a chance to succeed.
As for Rouhani, he says significant progress is being made. But on the outside looking in, caution.
Some people have suggested that Iran can help America solve the problems of the Middle East. But Iran is not part of the solution. It's a huge part of the problem.
So who to believe? Did this phone call a year ago really change the world? What do we want from Iran? What does Iran want from us? Can Rouhani, who still has to report to the Ayatollahs, be trusted? All good questions. Time for some answers. All right, let's start with a basic one. Sam, you do it. Why does Iran matter?
Peter, Iran is central to any prospect of peace and stability in the Middle East. It has been a major funder of Hezbollah. It is a significant backer of Assad in Syria. It is also involved militarily now in the war in Iraq, contributing 2,000 troops. And of course, it is the sworn enemy of ISIS. So we cannot talk about any prospect of peace in the Middle East without the Iranian question, addressing the Iranian question.
Saeed, do you want to add to that?
Sure. It's the largest country in the region, a population of 80 million, the second highest rated military behind Israel, the second largest economy behind Saudi Arabia, the fourth largest proven oil reserves, a country with millennia of civilizational history behind it, very influential with the Shia communities around the Gulf. Iran is a very, very important strategic partner as well as epicenter in the region.
All right. Well, there are the stakes. What's changed in a year since that phone call? We saw Obama on the phone. He was talking to Rouhani. What's changed, Janice?
Well, Peter, some good things happen, but there's also some disappointment. So what's the good thing that's happened? These nuclear talks have moved forward. There has been a relative freeze on Iran's nuclear program. Iran has honored that freeze. Nobody is alleging that Iran has cheated. And when they went to the wall just a week ago, they decided to extend the talks, which says to me, nobody wants to go backward. The disappointing part of the story, actually interesting, paying attention to what Iranians are saying. They're saying, you know, Rouhani has not really been able to keep many of his core promises to do better on the economy, to loosen some of the restrictions on civil liberty and freedom of expression. So it's a mixed record, and fundamentally, the central decision maker in Iran is not Rouhani, it's the Ayatollah.
Nader, what would you add to that list that Janice just gave us?
No, I would agree. There was a lot of optimism when that phone call happened, that after 35 years, two countries that hadn't been speaking to each other were now talking, and perhaps that would open the way to possibly U.S.-Iranian diplomatic relations. That's not going to happen because of the nature and character of the regime. The senior cleric, the Iran Supreme Leader, has repeatedly stated that there's two countries in the world that Iran will not have diplomatic relations with, the U.S. and Israel, and that has to do with the, I think, crisis of legitimacy that the regime faces and how it compensates for that crisis of legitimacy by virtue of playing up a certain anti-American narrative. So that didn't happen, but I think, as Janice, I think, rightly pointed out, the phone call did open the way to these nuclear negotiations, to the interim deal that we had last November, and to the ongoing sort of conversations that continue and that perhaps will lead to a final nuclear deal perhaps in the next 7 months. Also, I think that conversation did lead to something that has been reported in the media, 4 sort of private letters that President Obama has said to Iran's Supreme Leader, trying to coax him and bring him on side of a serious substantive negotiation on the nuclear question and possibly other regional issues.
And the Supreme Leader's being the leader being the Ayatollah, kind of Rouhani's boss, right?
Right.
Let me break this down a little bit in terms of, you know, most of the focus, especially for those of us who've been trying to follow this, has been on the nuclear question, and it's clearly important. But get us inside that room, if you can. What else is really being talked about there that has an impact on, you know, the Middle East as we see it and Iran's role in the world? Sam?
Well, a year ago, ISIS wasn't a significant player in the region. Now they are. They are a major threat to regional peace and security. They're certainly a huge problem for the Americans and for the Iraqis and for civilians in general in the area. So that's been a major factor. But for Iran, so these negotiations, even though they're saying they're not discussing ISIS as part of this strategy, we do know that Iran has been allied to a certain extent on the ISIS question. In addition to that, we also know that you know, when you look at Iran, that for them, this is also about how they're re-engaging with the world. This is about the modernization of Iran, the redefinition of Iran, and trying to have a new conversation and a new dialogue. Whether they are successful remains to be seen, but certainly they are trying to put a different face forward than the one that we've seen in previous years.
Saeed, what would you say to that?
Well, the direct quid pro quo for Iran is clearly the lifting of sanctions and perhaps the alleviation of its being perceived as a pariah state. I agree with Sam that ISIS is always going to be in the room. But if we see the way that Iran operates, they are not interested in taking a comprehensive look with these negotiations at solving all of the issues of the Middle East. We have to remember that back in 2006, this was attempted by then the Bush administration when it came to its founding policies and practices in Iraq. At that time, the Bush administration tried to insert the nuclear issue as well, and Iran said, nothing doing. We will talk about Iraq. We can talk about the nukes separately. And so when it comes to ISIS, we find that there is a parallel track. There is a tremendous level of cooperation and collaboration between the United States and Iran on that, but it is not a contingency when it comes to the nuclear talks.
Janice?
Yeah, I think the real driver here, Peter, are the nuclear talks. That is the chief engine. That is the hinge on which all this will depend. ISIS is a relatively short-term problem, first of all, unlike Iran, which is a long-term problem. And secondly, the role that Iran is playing against ISIS is not a critical role. It is bombing from the sky, but fundamentally it's involved in southern Iraq, Shia Iraq, which is not really involved in the confrontation with ISIS. So I think Iran's role against ISIS is overblown.
All right, let me break this down from either side. Nader, give me a sense, what does the West want from Iran right now?
Well, I think it fundamentally wants to curtail its nuclear program to make sure it doesn't have the capacity to build a nuclear weapon. If it, it doesn't want Iran to, have the benefit that comes with having a nuclear weapon. It becomes then much more powerful. It can throw its weight around in the region. I think that's fundamentally what the West is concerned about. It would like to see Iran play a more constructive role in other regional conflicts, but fundamentally this is about the West wanting to curtail, limit, and roll back Iran Iran's nuclear program.
Sam, you see it that way?
I do, and I also, for the Americans, it's about how long they are allowed to have unfettered access to make those kinds of inspections and to make that determination. So right now, this conversation around 5 years, the Americans and the Western countries more generally want that extended to well over 10 years. So it's not just about making sure that Iran doesn't get that nuclear capability, it's about making sure that we have access, we have eyes and ears on the ground to be able to assess that risk as we move forward, and for how long.
Okay, flip it on its head, Saeed. What does Iran want from the West?
Well, despite the fact that Iran has a gross domestic product of about $1 trillion, the sanctions that have plagued the country for so long now have had a very adverse effect, both when it comes to its infrastructure development. One of its sectors, its aviation sector, the estimates say that it needs 900 new commercial aircraft. So we find that these embargoes and these sanctions do have a crippling effect, and this is being felt by a public which is becoming increasingly restive about it. So clearly what we're finding here then is a reduction or even a removal of the sanctions, and again also this alleviation of Iran being perceived as this perennial pariah state.
If it's having that kind of impact, obviously it's a pressure point at the table. Janice, Iran from the West, what do they want?
Certainly they want the sanctions lifted, and they want a more open economy. They are suffering, there's no question about it. And Rouhani really drove a stake in the ground on that issue. When he was elected as president, he was going to improve the economy. What the United States and the other P5 want is what I call no breakout, no sneak out. And that's what makes this so tough. No breakout capacity. In other words, you can't develop a bomb in less than a year, but no capacity to cheat and sneak out, because there's been a history of that. So that's what, these are very tough negotiations with no necessary rainbow at the end of the talks next June.
And in terms of that no sneak out, we're talking about some clear supervision process in a post-deal world.
Well, that's really part of the dispute. You know, there isn't really unfettered access even now. There's a whole question of how much notice inspectors have to give of sites. And there's not really confidence even now that they've identified all the nuclear sites. So that's probably going to be the toughest one of all when we get down to the wire next June.
Okay, I've got to take a quick break, but one quick last question. You know, Canada's checked out of these talks with Iran. We closed our embassy.
We were never
Iran.
in, though, Peter, because we're not a P5.
We're not a P5. You know, that's a whole other program to explain what that means. But also we kicked them out of Ottawa.
Yeah.
Are we missing the boat here at a critical time?
I always think that some diplomacy is better than no diplomacy. And so I do think that it was a mistake to kick our embassy out. Not being a party to any level of conversation, discussion, interplay, I think is a huge missed opportunity. Whether we would have the force of presence, whether there's anything we can contribute to this dialogue remains to be seen. Although we have been a champion of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, Iran is trying to exercise its rights under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. So maybe we could have added some value there. But again, you know, we're not major players on this front, and so it's hard to say.
Okay, got to take a break.
We wouldn't be at this table. We're not a member of the Permanent Five on the Security Council, or we're not a +1. Nobody invited us.
Yeah, but you don't have to be at the table to have an impact, right?
Well, then you're doing it through the back door, and we still have that capacity.
But are we using it?
That's different.
All right, time for that quick break. But when we come back, this question. Are the Iranians just ragging the puck, or can seemingly endless talk actually produce peace? And welcome back to Turning Point, tonight on Iran. Janice Stein and Samantha Nutt are here in Toronto. Saeed Khan is in Detroit. Nader Hashemi is in Denver. You know, any success in any talks depends on trust, that both sides trust each other in some sense. And that's what I wanted to get to here. Is there any indication, Nader, you start us, that these two sides trust each other yet?
It's a given that we don't have trust between the two sides. If we had trust, we wouldn't be having this conversation to begin with. But I think the way forward when you have an existing problem is you have to have serious and substantive negotiations. You talk about the specifics, you talk about the details, and you fundamentally have to, you have to verify any sort of compliance. So I think, I'm reminded of this famous statement by Ronald Reagan at the height of the Cold War in the context of nuclear negotiations with the former Soviet Union, where he, famously and I think correctly said that, you need to sort of trust, but you also need to verify. And I think that's the way you sort of solve these deeply complex political questions.
All right. Saeed?
I agree with Nader, and certainly as we find that these talks are extending, I think that that process of trust and verification is also evolving. The Iranians have proven themselves to be very pragmatic. They certainly have a very practical and realistic outlook when it comes to their strategic objectives regionally. I think the bigger question that they're probably asking is how much can we really trust the United States? Clearly, we find that over the last several years, and certainly during the Arab Spring, American policy in the region has been seen as very mercurial, and this has not gone unnoticed both by America's allies as well as by Iran.
Janice, you've got not an insignificant outsider watching these talks in Netanyahu in Israel, and he keeps whispering, don't trust them, don't trust them. Is he being listened to?
I don't think he's being listened to, but I think he's a constraint on Obama. Obama has to take that seriously, only because Netanyahu is threatening some kind of military action if there is a bad deal. He prefers, he says, a bad deal to no deal. I think he's wrong. And what we're really seeing here, Peter, is a convergence of interest. It's in the interest of Iran to keep these talks going, and it's in the interest of Obama to keep these talks going, because the alternative for both of them is worse. And that's often the driver of negotiations that succeed.
Sam, you get the last word.
Do we trust Iran? No. Do we have any choice but to trust Iran? No. Diplomacy is not about getting the outcome you want, but about getting the outcome you can live with. And the alternatives really hold absolutely no appeal. So we have to keep pushing ahead.
All right. We'll leave it at that. Thank you all. Important conversation, and we thank all of you. And thanks to you as well. Your thoughts are always welcome. Please reach us at cbcnews.ca/thenational.